just feel massively offended. So just know that now. I'm joking. Well, let's start with a prayer. You know, I am a priest, so that's kind of what we do. And I'm also a Dominican, and so focusing on praying the Psalms, you know, it sort of marks that rhythm of our life as friars. So this is Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name through all the earth. Your majesty is set above the heavens. From the mouths of children and the babes, you have fashioned praise to foil your enemy, to silence the foe and the rebel. When I see the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you arranged, what is man that you should keep him in mind, the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the angels. With glory and honor you crowned him, gave him power over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet. All of them, sheep and oxen, yes, even the cattle of the fields, birds of the air and fish of the sea that make their way through the waters. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name through all the earth. Well, as Bridget said, I'm Father Samuel Hakim, Dominican Friar, Vocations Director for the Central Province Dominicans. I live in Chicago, Illinois. But before I became a Dominican, I had this deep passion, this deep love of physics. That's not something that went away when I put on this habit. But I started my study of physics. Well, really, it starts when I was about 5 years old. It's a common story with 5-year-olds. I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to fly among the stars. Now, a lot of 5-year-olds do, right? I went through a couple other professions when I was 5. I thought about being a goat farmer. So I realized it was really messy work. I thought about being a firefighter until I realized they run into burning buildings. I just wanted a Dalmatian and a fire pole, if I'm completely honest. But then the astronaut kind of stuck with me. And it was something that grew as I grew. And while a lot of 5-year-olds want to be astronauts, not a whole lot of 18-year-olds want to be astronauts. And so I took this dream and had morphed it into more of a feasible goal. This dream took me to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, a small school, kind of like Hillsdale. It was about 1,800 students when I started there. So I can relate to being on an awesome small campus, both the blessings of that, but also some of the sort of burdens of that as well. But Embry-Riddle's a special place, like Hillsdale, with a completely different focus from Hillsdale. This idea of liberal arts did not exist in my background. In fact, the first philosophy course that I took was my first year of studies as a Dominican friar. But I studied physics intensely, space physics in particular. Started by looking into astrophysics, but a couple nights in a freezing cold observatory out in the northern Arizona skies, and then a couple long days in front of a computer typing in programming, made me realize that the pictures from astrophysics are amazing. The actual science of astrophysics, not so much. It's a lot of grunt work sitting in front of a computer. And so I decided that wasn't for me. But cosmology really captured me. So I switched concentrations into particle physics and cosmology. In short, looking into the foundations of the created world, the foundations of the universe, both on a very large scale as well as on a very minute scale. So while I'm not working in that field anymore, I should say I graduated from Embry-Riddle. I started my PhD in optics at the University of New Mexico back in Albuquerque, where I grew up. And it was after my first year of graduate studies that I decided to leave studies and become a Dominican friar. So while I'm no longer working in the field or active in research in the field, this is still very much a passion of mine. It's kind of neat, actually, now that it's become more of a personal interest instead of a job or a future job. I find myself much more interested, much more fascinated, and much more delighting over what it is that I learn about physics, about the created world. So where does the Big Bang and the truths of faith fit into all of this? The story of the postulation and confirmation of the Big Bang has a whole lot to tell us. It's an important lesson on how we as people of faith should approach the sciences, or, since I kind of have feet in both worlds, how we as people of science should approach the truths of the faith. Now there's one big caveat. It's kind of an obvious one, given who I am, my title, my clothing, but I'm approaching this from a Catholic point of view, a Catholic philosophical and worldview point of view that might not be shared by all Christian denominations and certainly would not be shared by all people. But it's important to just know that what I'm speaking about comes from a Catholic point of view. I certainly would not exclude other Christians, but the way that we choose to interpret the Bible, the way that we choose to interpret certain tenets of the faith might be different, yet significant. So, the history of the postulation of the Big Bang. It all starts in 1927, actually, when this guy named Einstein, you might have heard of him, he comes with this theory of general relativity. It's really the first time in a truly scientific way that someone sets out to explain the entirety of the universe. What is the universe? What's its shape? How does it behave and interact one thing with the other? So this is a monumental theory that really revolutionizes physics. And it's unbelievable how correct Einstein was. Even down to our most recent monumental discoveries in cosmology, they are still confirming what Einstein sort of came up with in 1927 and refined during the rest of his working years. But at the same time, Georges Lemaître in Belgium proposes that the universe could be expanded. It's possible that this universe is expanding. Now, something you should know off the bat about Georges Lemaître. Not only was he active in the field of physics and cosmology, he was a Catholic priest as well, a Jesuit. So he too, like me, had feet in both worlds. In fact, even much more than me, because I jumped ship and he didn't. So way to go, Father Lemaître. But he was taken very seriously by his colleagues. He and Einstein were close friends, as with the other great names in physics of the day. A couple years later, 1929, another important name, Edwin Hubble. He confirms the fact that the universe is, in fact, expanding. He does so with observations. By using telescopes to look at the sky, we can see that some galaxies, some stars seem to be moving away from us in our location in space. Some seem to be moving closer to us. And this is done through science, if you will, called Doppler shift. You've experienced Doppler shift. And I'm assuming, so I hear that everyone here has to take a fundamental physics course. Is that right? I hope that they've taught Doppler shift in that fundamental physics course. But if not, anytime a siren passes by at a pretty high speed, you know how it seems to shift? The pitch goes up as it gets closer to you, and then as it goes away, the pitch drops back down. Well, that's Doppler shift. And it happens with all different types of waves. So when things are moving extremely fast toward you or away from you, the light that they emit is going to shift toward red or toward blue, based on whether they're moving toward you or away from you. So using this science, Hubble looks up at the sky, not with his eyes, but with instruments, with telescopes, and realizes that, wow, the universe indeed is expanding, or at least appears to be. So he comes up with Hubble's law, which defines an expanding universe. Now, there's still a lot of questions. What's the shape of the universe? How long has it been expanding forward? To what is it expanding into? Is the universe infinite and expanding infinitely, or is it somehow confined and around. So a lot of answers to still be, there's a lot of questions to still be answered. 2 years later, 1931, LeMaitre postulates a new theory. He calls it the primeval atom theory. Atom like ATOM. And in this theory, he says everything seems to be expanding, based on our observations, from a single point in space. We can look backward, follow and trace the directions that things seem to be expanding from. We realize that they seem to come together at a singular point. So in this theory, he says that at one point in history, billions and billions of years ago, all that exists had to have been contained in this single point. And further, in that single point, the laws of physics break down. The laws of interactions between bodies, the things that we know, they must just sort of break down because there's so much dense energy and matter that it doesn't really make sense to use our language to speak of what's going on there. And this sort of fits with Einstein's theory of general relativity, which defines how things interact, given gravity and other very strong forces. So he says that at this point, even time and space themselves have a beginning. Now that's a pretty strong postulation. That's a pretty strong theory. Like I said, it's based on Hubble's observations and some other science at that time. But because LeMaitre is a priest, as well as a physicist, some of his colleagues were sort of suspicious. And they accuse him of trying to force God into the equation. So LeMaitre has come up with this theory that would prove that there was a beginning and that God created everything. In fact, in order to try and sort of push this theory aside, they give it a silly name, the Big Bang Theory. So it's even supposed to be this ridiculous name. It's neat that it's now become this really neat, powerful name, but at the time it was, it's that Big Bang that God created, right? LeMaitre wasn't too happy with this because, here he was, a very serious scientist, a very legitimate scientist, and his life's work is being pushed aside just because he also happens to be a priest. So a number of years continue. He continues his research on this Big Bang Theory. He refines it. He comes to see mathematically that it makes sense. And then in 1951, Pope Pius XII, in an address to the Papal Academy of Sciences, itself seemingly a contradiction in some people's eyes, right? That the Pontifical Academy, the church in Rome, has a consortium of scientists. Well, many people say, I thought that science and religion are not compatible. They're not supposed to speak. Well, this has been going on for many, many years. And again, the work of this academy, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, is legitimate. So Pope Pius XII, in 1951, addressing the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and speaking about Lemaitre's work, he says, "It would seem that present-day science, with one sweeping step back across millions of centuries, has succeeded in bearing witness to that primordial fiat lux, uttered at the moment when, along with matter, there burst forth from nothing a sea of light and radiation, while the particles of chemical elements split and formed into millions of galaxies." Pretty neat, right? Here's the Pope speaking some mad science, if you will, trying to really engage and show that, look what Lemaitre did, and look how great it is that the church embraces the study of science. In fact, Lemaitre and his theory has shown that God was there and that God created from nothing. Now, Pope Pius XII meant well in doing what he was doing, but I don't think he realized the effect that it would have. And it's said that Lemaitre was very upset with the Pope's statement. One of his grad students, who was present in a seminar following this statement, said that Lemaitre was very, very troubled by it because he was already battling people who thought that he had no place, or people who thought that his theory was ridiculous just because he was trying to, quote unquote, work God into the formula. And here now the Pope, who was trying to be good and do good and support the sciences, has sort of stuck his foot in his mouth. So the problems. Number one, Lemaitre knew that this was still a young theory. Notice that the Pope talks about it as sort of this confirmed, finalized thing that, yes, we know this happened, and yes, it was God. And number two, that Lemaitre's theory says nothing directly about God. There's an important reason for that. So a couple of years later, 1958, at a physics conference, addressing his colleagues now in physics, Lemaitre is presenting his theory in full and again arguing for support of it. He had to address this question of its place within his religious background. He says, as far as I can see, such a theory, the Big Bang theory or primeval atom theory, remains entirely outside any metaphysical or religious question. It leaves the materialist free to deny any transcendental being. For the believer, it removes any attempt to familiarity with God. It is consonant with Isaiah speaking of the hidden God, hidden even in the beginning of the universe. When Pascal tries to infer the existence of God from the supposed infinitude of nature, we may think that he is looking in the wrong direction. So in other words, this is a theory of science, not a theory of philosophy, not a theory of faith or religion, but simply a theory of science. It says nothing about the bigger realities. It says nothing about the why. It just takes the observations of Hubble and others and draws conclusions from them. Namely, that conclusion was that at some point in history, all of matter, all of space and time was contained within one singular point. Now notice that this says nothing about before that point in history. In fact, it can't say anything about before that point in history because there's sort of a wall. We can't see before the Big Bang. So could there have been a before? Well, yes, perhaps. Could it have truly been the beginning? Yes, perhaps. But at this point in his life, at this point in his research, Lemaitre is not interested in those questions. Now, fast forward a little bit, still in this time, in the 50s and 60s, Lemaitre begins to speak very boldly and very openly about the importance of keeping these two things together, of living his life as a priest, as a religious, but also continuing his research in science. It's during this time, the 50s and 60s, that the divide between reason and faith begins to grow, especially here in the United States, but it was elsewhere as well. So in an interview, Lemaitre stated, the conflict between, the supposed conflict between faith and reason has always been between those who fail to understand the true scope of either science or religion. For those who understand both, the conflict is simply about descriptions of what goes on in other people's minds. So the conflict is only apparent. It's not a true conflict. It's actually just conflict of what goes on in another's mind. Later on in that same interview, do you know where the heart of the misunderstanding lies? He asked. It is really a joke on the scientists. They are a literal-minded lot. Hundreds of professional and amateur scientists actually believe that the Bible pretends to teach science. This is a good deal like assuming that there must be authentic religious dogma in the binomial theorem. So his point is that many people in the scientific community, many of his colleagues, we're looking at religion and saying, okay, well, you have scriptures that talk about creation, right? We have this story of creation, the beginning of Genesis. In fact, it's the thing that opens the scriptures. And in there, it talks about 7 days of creation. In the beginning, when God made the heavens and the earth, etc., etc. And they look at that and say, well, that's foolishness, because we have science, we have instruments, we have observations. We know for a fact, because of our observations, that this is not the case, these 7 days of creation. Therefore, you religionists are silly with what you believe, and the whole thing should be rejected. Well, as he says, that's like me as a religious person saying, oh, well, you have these mathematical proofs and formulae, and I don't see God in any of those. And since there's no dogmatic substance to these, since there's nothing that teaches me about God, we should just reject it all. It's silly. It's foolishness. In reality, we're speaking of 2 different realms. 2 different realms which are mutually supportive, mutually enriching. So, in the coming years, there are further observations that are made, more and more observations. And eventually, in 1965, what was thought to be a background noise in radio astronomy. So there's optical astronomy, right? Like looking through a telescope in the optical field and what we can see, the light that we can see, and making observations or doing research in what can be seen with the eye. But then there's also radio astronomy, which works in wavelengths that we can't see with our eyes. Again, I hope that this is covered in fundamental physics here, but if not, here's your lesson. That spectrum of light is much more than the spectrum that we can see. So radio observatories, using satellite dishes, pointing them at the sky and observing the universe, there was always this sort of background noise, this thing that was picked up in the background. And at first, astronomers just figured that this had something to do with the electronics, or maybe it had something to do with the atmosphere, the light passing through the atmosphere, maybe it's getting blocked or amplified or something. Well, in 65, a group accidentally discovers that this radiation is real. And it's across the entire universe. It becomes known as the cosmic microwave background radiation, CMBR for short. It was kind of the missing piece to the puzzle, which more or less verifies or very, very strongly affirms the Big Bang Theory as what had actually happened. They would go on and get the Nobel Prize about 10 years later, 12 years later. For some reason in physics, huge monumental discoveries don't immediately get the Nobel Prize, but it takes some time for that to sort of trickle down. Part of it is making sure that this was a legitimate discovery and not something that ends up being a fluke. It'd be really awkward and embarrassing to have to take a Nobel Prize back. But there we are 12 years later, and they get the Nobel Prize for discovering this cosmic microwave background radiation and confirming what Lemaitre had postulated so many years ago. And nowadays, in the field of cosmology, in the field of astrophysics and physics in general, the Big Bang is more or less accepted as the leading theory of how the universe came to be. As our instruments have gotten better, this has become more and more supported. So, as we know, light takes time to travel, right? Anything that travels takes time. So it took me 3 hours to drive from Chicago to Hillsdale. The light that reaches us from the sun is 8 minutes old. It takes 8 minutes for light to travel from the sun to the earth. So the farther you look into space, the older that light is. There's the Mars rover that went up about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The communications between Perseverance on Mars and here have about a 4-minute delay each way. Because again, that's signals of light, even though we can't see it, it's radio signals, but They're sent, and they take that long to travel to Mars. So when we look at objects that are extremely far away, we're looking back in time because it takes so long for that light to reach us here on Earth. So we can look further and further back into history by looking at objects that are further and further away. And the observations made by astronomers today fascinatingly confirm what went on so long ago. At the same time, we have high energy particle physics as well, huge particle accelerators, like the one in Europe at CERN, which are spinning particles extremely fast, smashing them together and seeing what happens. It's the ultimate physics thing, right? Like every little kid starts with like Hot Wheels cars usually, right? Throw them down the track in the opposite directions, watch them crash. Well, it's like the big boy version of that. Like extremely high powered energy and particles, smash them together and see what happens. Because obviously, if everything contained in the universe was at one singular point and banged, that's a lot of energy. And so in these discoveries, we're learning more and more about the nature of the universe. There's one thing that we haven't learned about, and one thing that most scientists would say we cannot learn about. And that's whether or not the Big Bang was truly the beginning. You see, I mentioned that there was a wall at that Big Bang, right? When we look backwards in time by looking at objects that are extremely far away, well, we can only get to the beginning of those objects. If before the Big Bang there were no objects, or if everything was contained within that singular point, well, there's nothing to see at that point. As Lemaitre said when he postulated this theory, time and space themselves, in a sense, begin at that point. That's important that he said in a sense, because he's not talking about the beginning of all of reality, but just time and space as we know it are wrapped into this story of, or not of creation, but of everything that is. So the question came up very early in Lemaitre's research, well, is it possible that we're on this infinite, eternal series of bangs and crunches, right? So the Big Bang happens, everything gets far apart and eventually slows down because of gravity. And once it slows down, it stops at a point and starts coming back together. Is it possible that everything at some point before the Big Bang came back together and had a big crunch, big smash together, back to down to that singular point, and then again, boom, exploded out? Lemaitre thought that this was very poetic there. Now we're speaking liberal arts language. It was very poetic that there's sort of this phoenix nature to the universe, right? It destroyed and recreates itself from that fire. I thought that's really beautiful, but again, we don't know. Is it possible that there was something contained within that singularity, some other form of physics or of life or something that we could never get back to? Well, yes, it's possible, but we don't know. And nor can we really ever know. So what happened before the Big Bang is not really a question answerable by science today, and many physicists, myself included, would say is not an answerable question ever. Will never become an answerable question. So the question of a before is kind of unimportant to Lemaitre. Remember that both the Pope, well, I should say that there's a legend that he pulled Pius XII aside and it's like, come on, man, stop this. You're messing with my science. But my friends are embarrassing me. It's like getting mad at dad for dad jokes, but instead of dad, it's the Pope. But there is this legend that he did pull the Pope aside and asked him to please stop talking about the Big Bang because he wasn't getting the science accurately. And it was leading to further difficulty for Lemaitre in his theory. But he's not interested in this scientific theory as a proof of the existence of God, nor as a proof that God sort of created using this Big Bang, that this was the beginning of everything. Now, of why would Lemaitre not be interested in that question? Is it because he's a Jesuit? Even though I'm a Dominican, I will say no, that's not the reason. In fact, I would say it's because he's an incredibly brilliant theologian, an incredibly brilliant scientist. Dominicans love to rag on Jesuits and vice versa. We've had this sibling rivalry for literally centuries. At one point, the Pope put us both in timeout and told us that we were not allowed to talk about a certain issue again. They banned us from ever mentioning the rights controversy that happened in China and just said, stop it, you're done. I have a certain fondness for certain Jesuits. My dissertation, or not my dissertation, my thesis director was a very good and holy Jesuit, Father Dave McConey, in St. Louis. So I can sort of poke him sometimes too. But Lemaitre knew, in particular, Thomistic philosophy, St. Thomas Aquinas, a good Dominican. In Thomas's Summa, in the first book of the Summa, question 46, article 2, if you know how the Summa is broken down, he posits that by faith alone do we hold, and by no demonstration can it be proved, that the world did not always exist. So it's a question on, can we prove that the world was created? Can we prove using reason, using science, that the world was created? So back in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas is saying, no, we cannot prove that to be true. We have to just accept it as a tenet of the faith, right? And that's what we get from the first chapter of Genesis, is that there was a time before there was anything, and that creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, happened by God. He brought something out of nothing. However, we can never prove that to be true. Now, this was radical and somewhat controversial back in the 13th century. In fact, Bonaventure, a Franciscan, said, oh, of course we can prove that to be true. Now, Bonaventure's proof is one that's philosophical in nature. Thomas seems to be speaking, although these terms didn't really exist yet, he seems to be speaking in scientific terms, in science in the way that we talk about it today, not in just general knowledge, but in scientific terms. So Bonaventure's proof is that, well, if there was never a 0 point, if this has been going on infinitely, then how did we get to a now? You can't start at negative infinity and get to now. It's a very convoluted philosophical way of thinking. It makes no sense. And I say this defending Thomas as a good Dominican, and it doesn't make any sense because what we know is that we are at a now, right? That we do exist, we're here on Earth. I'm not going to get into all sorts of rational questions of, is this some sort of brain in a vat experiment? Let's trust that the laws of nature are what they are. We do know that we are here, and we know that the universe has a past, but we can only look so far into that past. And to say that, oh, well, it couldn't be infinite because we would never approach now, well, that makes no sense. It's trying to start at infinity, but we have to start with here and now. So Aquinas says we can't prove that there was a starting point. There's no scientific way or rational way to prove that there was a starting point. So we accept it on faith, right? It's been revealed in the scriptures. It is a tenet of faith that creation happened by God from nothing into something. So Lemaitre knows this to be true, and many centuries later is proving that still to be true, or holding that to still be true. So science has its realm in explaining the laws of the universe, the existence of the universe. Science does not have its proper realm in explaining or defining or proving the truths of the faith. Now that's a very bold claim, because oftentimes we try to use science to back up what it is that we believe in faith. And there is a proper way to do so, but it's something that we have to very carefully walk through. It has to do with the distinction between fact and belief, and there's sort of a third category, if you will, of opinion. So what is a fact? I'm asking you all now. What's a fact?
It's something that you can prove through repeated observation.
Something that is provable through repeated observation. What else? Yeah.
I would just say a fact is what is.
A fact is what is.
Like that you're saying, how can you know a fact? But the fact itself would be what is.
All right. I like both of these. Both of these are important. What else? Anything else? We're pretty much there. A fact is something that is, that can be shown to exist. That's demonstrable. And not demonstrable in a sort of theoretical way, but the fact is we are in Hillsdale. We're at Hillsdale College. This is a podium. I can point and, well, how do you know it's a podium? Well, podium. It's just there. I could define what a podium is and show that this fits the definition, but we don't really have to get into those things, right? The facts simply are. I am 33 years old. That's a fact. I live in Chicago. I was going to say I could show you my driver's license. My driver's license does not yet say Chicago. It still says Wisconsin. Thank you, COVID. It's really hard to get a driver's license right now in Chicago. But these are all facts, right? They are known to be true. Now, what's a belief?
I mean, I would say you're talking about beliefs there, how we would understand a fact.
We're going to get there. You're jumping one step ahead, but you're on the right track. You're super on the right track here. What is a belief, though, just properly speaking?
I guess some like idea that we just take on, I guess loosely by faith. We take on by faith. Not, I guess, faith, I mean generally not strictly religious, but we take on by faith.
Yeah, so it's still in the realm of knowledge, right? It's something that is or is not. It has to do with the reality of things, but they're things that are accepted as not fully proven. Now, there are two different realms of faith. There's religious faith, and there's sort of a natural mode of faith, a non-religious mode of faith. Now, they're not against each other or anything, but there are ways in which we employ faith to make these ends meet. So, has anyone here been to Antarctica? Okay, good. I keep switching the country that I use for this. I know Antarctica is a continent, but I keep switching the country or the place that I use because I'll say a different one and someone's like, yeah, I've been there. Dang it, that was my tip. So how do you know that Antarctica exists?
Google Maps.
But how do you know that that's real?
I think it's a hoax personally.
These are anti-Antarctica. The new truther. What are they teaching? Yeah. Believe it on authority. So what are the authorities here? People who have been to Antarctica, right? First eyewitnesses, first person witness accounts that, yes, I've been there. I've seen the penguins. I know that it exists. One of my good friends from Embry-Riddle spent a few winter terms down there at the big neutrino observation observatory. He said it was pretty amazing to watch the sun set, knowing that it would not rise again for 3 months. And then on the other end of that, watching the sun rise again for the first time in 3 months was just unbelievable. I mean, it's the miracle of life and creation in this really beautiful way. But yeah, so we accept the testimony of trustworthy experts or eyewitnesses. Now, what about the other type of belief? Religious belief. Let's talk about that a little bit. So how can we define religious belief?
Regards revelation.
Mm-hmm. So what is revealed? What are the sources of revelation for us as Christians? Yeah.
God in the world.
God in the world. So we have God who reveals through the world, right? We have tradition with a big capital T, which includes the scriptures and what has been handed down For us as Catholics, what has been handed down throughout the centuries of the church's existence. And these are revealed truths given to us to accept. Now, there are some which are core tenets of our faith, right? The biggest one among them, the existence of God. That's kind of important if you're going to call yourself a Christian. If you say I'm a Christian, but I don't really think that God exists, well, hate to tell you, but that's kind of central. Can we point to God? Like I pointed to this podium.
Yes,
Say more.
we have the Eucharist, although that one we believe is God based on faith.
Bingo. When I point to the Eucharist, I might be pointing to Christ, right? And I am pointing to Christ. Don't. Oh Lord, I'm getting myself in trouble on recording. No, I absolutely 100% believe that the Eucharist is Christ, right? But when I point to the Eucharist, other than in instances of miracles and visions, which tend to be more private revelations, can I show that I'm pointing to Christ? It's okay. No, we're not denying anything. We are not denying the reality of the Eucharist in saying so. This is a huge tenet of belief. That God is a Trinity. Another super duper important one for us as Christians, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons, 1 God. Is there some way I can like point and say, look, there's the Trinity? St. Augustine sure tried. His De Trinitate, there are about 5 chapters in there, where he's just pointing everywhere, looking for trinities in nature, in the human person, mind, body, soul. He's doing all these, mental gymnastics. He basically comes to the end of it and it's like, well, that was stupid. Because you can't point and definitively prove that there is the Trinity, or even point and definitively prove that there is God. Now, does this mean that God does not exist, or that God is not a Trinity, or that Christ is not present in the Eucharist? Would we make those claims? No, hopefully not. Because we have this realm of belief, this realm of religious belief. So I would say that religious beliefs are facts, but of a different kind. They're things which are accepted as true on revelation, and they're held to be as if they were proven to be true. And we all have them, whether or not we are religious. Even an atheist who says there is no God, can an atheist point to no God, or the non-ness of God? Can an atheist point to the non-existence of God and prove it to be true as a fact? No, right? There might be reasons why an atheist might think that way, but an atheist cannot point and say, there's the no God, there's the vacuum, the hole where God should be. Some claim to have done so, but they're silly, philosophically speaking. In the same way, though, we have to be honest. Sometimes religious people can be silly in proofs as well, saying, well, I've proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that God exists. I can point and say, there is God. Oftentimes it's using science, right? Like Pope Pius XII tried to do, very innocently tried to do. And say, well, look, there's God. Well, we proved it to be true. And we can't fully do that. It doesn't work. Because again, we're talking about 2 different realms. We're talking about belief, and we're talking about facts. Now let's jump back to what was going on here with the how do we sometimes believe facts? So the fact that Antarctica exists, right? I hope we're not denying the fact that Antarctica exists. It does exist. We know it to be there, but we accept it to be true on the witness of others. This one has sort of started to break down in society, which infuriates me. So things like flat earthers. I haven't seen that the earth is round, therefore the earth is not round. If we have to see everything before we believe it, we're hopeless. We're going to get nowhere as human beings. We're going to get nowhere as a species as well. People that deny even the moon landing. You have outside the Heritage Room, you have nerd NASA things. As soon as I see them, my eye goes to them. Those Apollo 11 and Gemini patches from Neil Armstrong, from who else was on there? Cernan, and I forget who the third one was. But like those patches have been on the moon. Those people in the pictures on the moon, those are not faked. We can accept those as true based on the support of trustworthy witnesses. So there's a way in which belief enters into our scientific realm. Now, I'm a Dominican, which means I've taken a vow of poverty, which means that this is a lot of money. It's $20. What is going to happen if they let go of this $20? If someone can prove that to me before I let go, I will give you this $20 bill. So prove to me, all you've done is proven to me that your phone is falling. And you also need a new screen.
Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Are you talking about specifically that $20 bill?
This
or-
$20 bill.
Ah.
Prove that this $20 bill is going to fall when I let go.
Are we allowed to bring God into the picture?
F equals MA.
F equals MA. How do I know that F isn't going to equal negative MA the moment I let go of this bill?
Because physics.
Because physics. You're speaking my language, however, you still haven't proven to me that it's going to stay the same.
Because I believe that God wills the universe to operate in a consistent way, and according to my observation, it seems to operate in a consistent way, and every dollar bill that I've ever dropped has fallen. So it seems to suggest
So
there's
you're
a very
speaking
likely chance.
extremely soundly and perfectly, but the second word out of your mouth destroys your argument. What was the second word out of his
I
mouth?
forget.
Believe.
Believe. So it's not a fact, right? You're not proving it, you're believing it. You're on the right track though. We're gonna come back to it, so hold on to that. Anyone else want to take a crack at it? Hope that it goes down.
Yeah,
I do too.
Otherwise, you have a different conversation.
So this is the joke that I've made up every time I've given this talk, that one of these times I'm gonna let go, and it's gonna float up, and I just be like, okay, I'm going home. But the reality is we cannot prove the events of nature. But does it make sense to believe that? Right? It's like you said, every bill that's ever been dropped out of fingers here on Earth, we have to be very specific with our terms, but every bill that's ever been dropped out of fingers here on Earth has fallen to the ground because we have this force of gravity, F equals ma, and that's just simply what happens. And we can trust that the laws of physics are going to remain constant from one moment to the next. Another example, what's going to happen tomorrow morning regarding the sun?
Oh, I don't know. I was.
Oh, you don't know? Anyone know? What's going to happen tomorrow morning regarding the sun?
Well, the earth will rotate, so it will look like it will rise.
So the sun's going to rise, right? I don't mean to overcomplicate things. I've had to think, how do I ask this without making it sound like I'm asking a trick question? The sun's going to rise. There's really no way to prove that, right? Like we know what's happened in the past. We have this great historical record that for days, for ages on end, the sun has come up. There's a good reason to believe that that's going to happen tomorrow. In fact, if I told you the sun's not going to rise tomorrow, you would look at me like I'm a fool. And I probably would be a fool because I'm taking what we know to be true in the natural laws of physics, and I'm extrapolating those forward in time. So I'm using belief, I'm using faith to employ the laws of nature, or to accept and believe that the laws of nature are going to remain constant. So those who believe that science has the answer to everything, and that we need no faith Well, it's kind of self-defeating because even the laws of science we accept on belief. This is very true in extremely large and extremely small things in physics too. We can't directly see them. However, we have to rely on instruments to observe them. We can trust and believe the accuracy of those instruments. We can trust and believe in what's going on in these very fine-tuned, minute details. So we use faith all the time in a natural mode, in a scientific mode. However, the type of faith that we use in that natural mode and the type of faith that we use in religious mode are two different things. There's an important distinction there. When we're talking about religion, we're accepting revealed truths that have been handed on through the ages, handed down through the ages. When we're talking about nature, we're talking about the natural world and everything that exists within it. So then what are we to do with faith and with science? Are they just sort of forever separate and we sort of appreciate and value both? Or is there some way in which they can interact? Is there some sort of crossover between the truths of faith as believed and revealed and accepted and the facts of nature that we see, or the facts of nature that we believe, the testimony of others, or on the acceptance that the laws of nature alone stay the same? Well, if there's one thing, and there's much more than one thing, but if there's one thing that I absolutely appreciate, I love about my Catholic faith, it's the fact that it's rational. It's in line with reason. It makes sense. In fact, the truths of the faith are supported by reason. In other words, it's reasonable to believe everything that the church puts forward, especially on the grand scale, on the big scale of things. It's reasonable to believe these things. This was huge with St. Thomas Aquinas. He employed this all the time. Has anyone heard of his 5 proofs for the existence of God? And these are famous, right? Thomas Aquinas, 5 proofs for the existence of God. What's the problem with the 5 proofs? Do they prove the existence of God? They don't. So they're not proofs, properly speaking. Just like, you couldn't prove that the dollar was going to hit the ground. However, it's important to know how Thomas ends each of his responses in those 5 proofs. He comes down to a point, a force, or some sort of conclusion. He says, this seems to be what we call, or what people call, God. So he shows that it's reasonable to believe that God exists, that there's a lot of evidence to support the belief that God exists, but none of these 5 proofs are the great finger that can point to God. They just sort of point toward God. The truths of nature can tell us a lot about God. They support what it is that we believe about God. So we have this vast universe. We have this moment of some sort of Big Bang. And it's possible that that was the beginning of everything that there is. But it's also possible that there was a before. So it's hard to, you can say, well, it fits the story of creation from nothing quite well. And it might support some evidence toward that fact. But again, remember that it's a tenet of belief handed on to us from Thomas Aquinas that we have to accept on belief and not on fact that there was a beginning to the universe, because we can't observe before that Big Bang. But still, we have this marvelous universe to look at. Marvelous universe that's very intricately and finely designed and detailed. Marvelous universe and the gift of a brain to comprehend what goes on in the universe. Putting these two together tells us that God delights in his creation. It supports a creative God who is benevolent, who is good, who wants us as human beings to follow in his footsteps in enjoying the goodness of what is. It supports the ideas of beauty being fundamental to who God is as well, and even unity of all things in God. So we can draw inferences and we can draw support for our beliefs by studying the stars, by studying the fine-tuned details of nature. But it would be improper to point to them and say, there is God, there. So at the end of the day, we're left in awe, left in mystery, appreciative of what God has given us, appreciative of the mind that we have to be able to look into these mysteries, but not solving through those mysteries, not reaching through them and pretending like we've proven away our faith. Because if faith were provable, our efforts in evangelization would be nothing more than handing out textbooks. Here, just read this, and you'll see why God exists, and you're done. But God is much bigger than that. The mystery of God touches down to the core of who we are. Much can be discovered within that mystery, but can never be explained away. So at the end of the day, a good theologian and a good physicist share one thing in common. That's knowing when we've hit the boundary of knowledge, when it's best to just sit silently, look up, and enjoy the stars. So if anyone had to leave by 8 o'clock, it's 8 o'clock now, so you might want to run. But if we have time for questions, I'm open to taking some. So, yeah.
I don't understand why Thomas says that there needs to be a beginning. Like, couldn't you have God like creating an eternal universe? And
Yeah,
just,
so-
supporting it from underneath, kind of.
Right. The big starting point for Thomas is Scripture. And so, since we have in Scripture that there was a beginning, therefore there must be a beginning.
Like, but if we're already going to say Genesis is, we're not going to interpret Genesis literally, are we sort of interpreting a little bit of it literally and then saying the rest of it is figurative? Isn't that a little bit messy?
It is, but Genesis isn't the only place where we hear of God being the creator of all things.
Well, he could still be the creator, but it just wouldn't be like he creates in the sort of sequence of time that the universe exists in, and it would be more like Aristotle would still say that like God is conceived of in like causes the universe,
Mhm.
but he would conceive it as being an infinite universe.
So the other big thing for Aquinas is in Exodus, God's name being I am, which has for centuries been taken up really since the beginning of the church, and even before then, because this is the Hebrew scriptures, has been taken to say that God is the only thing that is eternal, the only thing that has existed forever. Now, when we're talking about time and infinity, our language breaks down, especially when we're talking about God and time and infinity. We live in time. It's impossible to speak of timelessness correctly, because even that word, right, timelessness, it's using the word time to define a time without time. It doesn't really make sense. Our language breaks down. So is it possible that somehow God exists outside of this constantly existing thing? Well, yes-ish, but you still have to posit that God created from nothing, which still sort of posits a beginning. So we run into the breakdown of language there, but it is, there is some wiggle room there.
Right, because like God is not eternal in the sense of having existed for an infinite amount of time. It's like time just doesn't apply to him. So could you imagine a situation? I'm not saying I think this is how it is, but could you imagine a situation in which you have a universe which has existed and will exist for an infinite amount of time, but God is still prior to it and is like sort of creating it at every moment that it exists?
Yes, but it's in my opinion, it's easier to believe a beginning. But I mean, this is a very contemporary thing in the philosophy of physics and religion as well, the way that religion speaks to it. Even if we could somehow prove that the universe is infinite in time, it does not break down this idea of creating the universe and being prior to it. So,
So like one of the probably the most common interpretation of quantum mechanics is the Copenhagen interpretation, which is what you learn in basically every physics quantum mechanics course. But there's also different interpretations as well, like the many worlds interpretation and whatnot. And I guess from that, and also as like general relativity and that kind of theory of the universe has developed, there's also been other scientists who posit other theories about like the universe and stuff like there actually was no Big Bang, and I don't know exactly what,
Yeah.
but what would you have to say about other
So,
theories like that?
this was sort of my like extra credit bit that I wasn't sure if I was going to get time to talk about, but since you asked, guess what? There, in my opinion, there are two philosophically coherent explanations of the universe, of what exists. Either there's a creator, and there are lots of different opinions, lots of different theories, but in my opinion, these are the only two that are completely philosophically coherent. Either there's a creator who created the universe, all that is, including us, all the way down to every fine-tuned detail. That creator we call God, to use the language of Aquinas. Or there are infinitely many possibilities that all exist simultaneously as infinite universes, as a multiverse. So that if there's a possibility that can exist, it must exist. This is the premise of Rick and Morty. The woman who was here had a Rick and Morty sweatshirt on, and I was going to get into that. This was my opening lecture when I taught in college, because some of my friends had me watch a few episodes, and I was horrified. But at the same time, it's an incredibly philosophically coherent show. It plays with nihilism in a really scary way, and it shows what nihilism looks like in its sort of finality. Nothing matters because everything just exists. Everything that can possibly exist exists. There's one episode where Morty's the older one, right? The grandpa figure. Rick's like having this really hard time existentially jumping from multiverse to multiverse. I think if I remember correctly, they're burying their own bodies. So it's like this really awful, morbid picture. But Rick says, well, what about the universe in which Hitler cured cancer? Try that one, Morty. And nothing matters, right? There is no goodness. There is no nothing. It just simply coldly exists. That's really, really awful, really scary. But it's philosophically coherent. Now there's a problem. That multiverse theory is no more provable than the fact that there is the belief that there is a creator. And in fact, in my opinion, easy for me to say, I'm a Catholic priest, there's a lot more support for believing in a creator than there is support for an infinite universe multiverse theory. Now, the reason why I think that those are the only two logical answers is because as soon as you take one of those possible existences out, there has to be something external that removed it. And so now we've worked God back into the picture. So this is sort of high-level philosophy of science stuff, but either everything exists or there's a creator who designed what does exist. In my opinion, those are the philosophical answers. Now, other interpretations of quantum mechanics, though, there are other valid ones that don't get into crazy things like multiverses or alternate worlds. This is also a really neat study in the philosophy of science. It begins with Einstein again. Everything begins with Einstein in modern physics. But there are some major problems with quantum mechanics. There are two, in fact, that it seems like either the speed of light is not the constant, is not the maximum speed limit of the universe, or somehow things are affecting each other across a distance instantaneously. Both of those are problematic for physics, and you have to break one of them in an interpretation of quantum mechanics. But there are other interpretations of quantum mechanics which are mathematically valid. Pilot wave theory is one of these that has sort of reappeared in recent times and is scientifically kind of beginning to gain some steam again, which is cool. So there's a philosophical question when it comes to quantum mechanics. So are we modeling nature and applying this sort of standard model of math, or are we actually describing what's truly physically happening? And it sounds like when we get to the quantum level, we're explaining with models what we can't physically observe yet and might not be able to physically observe ever. Not that we can't observe quantum interactions, but we don't quite understand the details of why things are happening at that level. So, yeah, I hope that kind of answers it.
Yeah.
You gave me a chance to jump into this other path, but yeah. So I would reject some of these more theoretical, wacky ideas. That's where I'd say like science has left science, the realm of science, where it belongs, and moved into the realm of philosophy. Because you're postulating things that could never be proven, could never be experimented. And when Isaac Newton invented science as we know it, it was all about postulating based on observations. So, yeah, good question. Anything else? Let's go in the back, then we'll come up front.
So I guess there's kind of a percentage of the population who just kind of just randomly agrees, oh, science has proven that God doesn't exist, and that's just kind of their whole blanket argument, even though there's no real honest dialogue or investigation that they put into it. Where do you think maybe would be a good place to start to just to bring up faith, just in terms of just like, hey, Christ came to earth, and we want you to know about it?
Right. So starting with someone who is this hyper rational, I don't need faith, I have science. There's this like this foundational view or belief that faith was sort of what took the place or held the place of science until science could fill in the gaps, right? And it comes from this sort of ancient Greek or ancient Roman view of the gods were the forces behind, or even we see it in Plato and Aristotle, right? The eternal beings in some way are the ones that move the spheres of the heavens. Oh, well, no, we learned about gravity. We don't need those eternal beings anymore. And so it's this really flawed view of what religion is. Religion was never just a placeholder for what we don't know. It wasn't like this placeholder of mystery until we can fill in the gaps. Religion for us is more about who we are and is about a relationship with the living God. But jumping directly into that with a non-believer, with an ultra-scientific person, is not particularly going to be helpful. However, we have history on our side. All of the major significant scientific discoveries, I shouldn't say all of them, but a huge number of them throughout the centuries happened in religious settings, whether they were academic institutions run by the church or monasteries themselves. Gregor Mendel, who came up with genetics and there's a lot of evolutionary stuff in there. He was a priest. Georges Lemaitre, why would Georges Lemaitre have come up with a theory that, well, as we see, some take it as supporting the existence of God. But why would they come up with these things if they were, if science is supposed to be opposed to religion or throw out religion? And there are many different examples. Even so, our province, the Central Province Dominicans, were the province of St. Albert the Great. It said that Albert the Great was the last person to know everything that there was to know. This is the scholastic period when knowledge was sort of this one single body. But he was a scientist. Would have never been called a scientist. He was called a natural philosopher back then. But he wrote on the animals. Actually, some of his descriptions of animals and the ways they are and why they are hilarious by modern standards. But he was very interested in the behavior of animals. He was interested in alchemy, so what we would probably call chemistry today. He was interested in astrology, which today we would consider astronomy. these things were very different back then. The influence and effect of the stars and the movement of the stars and why, the behavior of animals and the mixing of elements to hopefully get gold was sort of the goal of alchemy. But still, this sort of mixing of elements was science. So if people of faith, true people of faith, aren't afraid to engage the sciences, then doesn't that suggest that their view of faith is lacking, is incorrect? So that's sort of how I make my way in. And then once your foot is in the door, you can talk a little bit more about other things. There have been moments, I have the uniform on my side, but I've seen jaws drop when they find out that I studied physics. It's like, wait, and this is on both sides, though. This is on super hyper rational people that would reject religion, as well as super religious people. Like, what do you mean you studied physics? You're not supposed to study physics. You're a priest. It's like, really? Go to Hillsdale College. They'll teach you differently. So there is, but the more we can sort of get our foot in the door and break down that hard divide between the two, the better chance we have of evangelizing, essentially. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. Could you talked about it a little in the beginning, just with the Big Bang kind of creation of the universe. But in my opinion, I think one of maybe the harder points, especially in Catholic circles, when discussing science versus religion, is kind of the creation of the universe versus the creation of man. There's a lot of people who can they'll be fine accepting the universe, but then there's a whole bunch of religious dogma about the creation of man that sets man apart from the rest of creation. So how can you reconcile the two from a scientific or religious perspective?
Right, that's a good question. So the big sort of elephant in the room, if you will, is evolution, right? That the species seems to have evolved throughout time, throughout the thousands and thousands of years. The human species evolves from something. I understand Father Nicanor Austriaco. When was he here?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. So he's a Dominican as well, and a biologist with a PhD from MIT. Incredibly smart guy. But he has this beautiful talk on evolution. And I'm paraphrasing, and someone who was at that talk might be able to fill in the picture better. Basically, there was some point along that evolutionary, this is an acceptable Catholic view, which holds the two together. This creation of man is something special, as well as evolution and what biology tells us likely did happen in evolution. Again, we can't point to it and say, obviously this happened, but what likely did happen. There had to have been a point in that evolutionary cycle where the human soul was infused by God. So we would say that there was some divine action at that point, that this lineage of our ancestors evolves, but eventually reaches this point, which is human being, as we know it and as we are. It's at that point that an immortal soul is infused by God. So it is, again, this is something we have to accept on belief. We can't point to it and say there was when God came down and touched Adam and when that became human. But it's still acceptable to. It can be accepted in an evolutionary framework. Was that kind of his approach?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that is sort of the traditional scientific Catholic thing. The church does not demand that we believe in evolution, but the church does say that there is strong reason to believe that evolution occurred, and supports evolution as a theory of how species came to be. So, yeah. That's another really tricky area, though, because people on the scientific side, as you say, well, the church doesn't care, and they have their story of creation. And, people were created from the dirt. And, we were reading ancient Jewish literature, and within an ancient Jewish worldview and system, it communicates very important truths that God created, that man and woman are created in the image and likeness of God, and that we're built for relationship, both with each other and with the living God. And those are the important truths that are told by the story of Genesis. However, they don't say much about the science. So going back to Rachel's quote about scientists, both amateur and professional, look and think the Bible is supposed to be a book of science, when that was never the case. So, any other questions? I'll hang around for a little while if anyone wants to talk on the side, but thank you all for coming. Been a joy being